The Book of Judges, Compromise, Apathy, and Rebellion. Hello, everyone. My name is Persohn. You can contact me at pastor@mascot.church, which is my email address, or in the comments below if you like. If you like any of these videos, share them or subscribe to the channel or whatever. YouTube might then recommend them on to somebody else. But as I often say, you just never really know what big tech is doing. And our stuff isn't that controversial, so yeah, who knows? So just keep us in your prayers. We've got one of the busier and more challenging weeks of our lives coming up, my children and myself and close family. But we are forging ahead and continuing to do what needs to be done. As the Dutch always say, or said in many times, the cows still need to be milked. You still have things that you have to do. It's a pleasure to be back with you today. Part of my regular devotion is this time is the Book of Judges. What I do is I read the scriptures from cover to cover, and typically in the same translation, though I might vary next time around. We'll see how we go. And the only things I change are the order of the prophets, because I always look forward to getting to the prophets. So what we have when we get to our Bible, we have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, these big books, which are considered the major prophets, followed by the minor prophets, which some of them are quite large as well. But because the orders are skewed, it's a little difficult. But when you group them by epoch, at least, you say there were prophets who prophesied before the fall of the northern kingdom. Then there were prophets who prophesied after the fall and before the fall of the southern kingdom, which would include like Jeremiah and Ezekiel and so on, and then Daniel in that period of time. There's other prophets there, and then there's prophets who prophesied after the exile was over. So when you group them together along with those books, the reading is much more uniform. That's another discussion. But I'm in the Book of Judges today, this week, and the Book of Judges is just a tough read. Well, it's easy to read, but this story after story, they're just really awful stories. The core recurring theme, I guess, if you will, in the Book of Judges is the statement that people did what was right in their own hearts. And so you get this sense of the degradation of society so quickly after God will rescue the people, and then they'll do what's right in their own hearts, and there's trouble. So one of the questions I have had for years about the purpose of the Book of Judges, or was about the purpose of the Book of Judges. And there are many purposes of this really fascinating book. Just a couple of points today that might help you to read this book quite, with more of a different attitude. Off the top, the purpose of the Book of Judges, the first one that jumps off the page, is to demonstrate the absolute depravity of people without God when they reject his law. Like this, no question, you say, how depraved are you? I'm going to try to turn some flashing off down here on my screen. That might help. It's distracting me. And this is the first one, when people go their own way, the trouble, and how God would redeem his people. He would deliver his people. He'd send people like Gideon and so on and so forth. And a lot of the times, some of the times the people that he sent weren't particular saints either. Samson was probably, you could say, he was a villain. Those stories that you read about Gideon and Samson, they're embellished for Sunday school, but really, look at the lives of Gideon. Samson, I should say. Gideon is a little bit different, but look at Gideon's son. Wow, what a terrible story. And then the stories towards the end of the book. However, back to this. Demonstrates what happens when people go their own way and do what's right in their own hearts. And you can really look at the Book of Judges and look at civilizations that have collapsed, and maybe even the great Western Empire that's collapsing, and say, yes, I wonder if there are things in common. Not everyone in the Book of Gideon, the Book of Judges, that's featured there is a hero. Some are like villains, but they still get a place. And you see that kind of towards the very end, the terrible story of the Levite and the concubine. It's like still hard to read, even though I understand. There's a couple of other things that jump off the page now that I've come to grasp this really fascinating book. And one of them is that rebellion is common in the human soul. We just want to rebel, even though things were good when we weren't rebelling. We want to rebel anyways, and that's a common theme in Judges. It just comes again and again and again. The one I spoke about in Sunday last week was the issue of compromise. When the nations were, when God moved the people into the land, they were supposed to drive out many of the pagan and highly corrupt peoples and not associate with them. And they weren't to worship their gods or to intermarry or anything, move the people out. And God had sent, they say, well, that seems very unfair, but God had sent prophets and priests and so on to I would say priests anyways, to some of those nations. Moses' father-in-law was a priest of Midian. So you have this, they would have known the law of God at some time, but they rebelled against it. It was time for their nations to be removed, to be wiped out. Again, think about this in terms of where we might be in our civilization as well. Really fascinating. Nevertheless, they didn't often do it. You'll say, well, they didn't overcome, they chose not to drive them out, and so on and so forth. And in one case, they didn't, and we'll do a little more detail on this if early on in Judges, someone didn't drive people out because they had iron chariots, but that really was never going to be an issue. God would have protected them and helped them anyways. Very interesting passage. I dealt a little more with this, my Sunday morning message last week. Nevertheless, what you have here is compromise. You have people who are moved into the land that were supposed to do things that compromised. Think about the things that cost you in your life. I think about the things that cost me in my life. Outright rebellion against God. Yep. Compromise is the other one. Now, there are things that you need to compromise about, and there's places that you need to compromise. Marriage is a constant journey of compromise, raising children, living in community all the time. However, if you read the scriptures, and I encourage everybody to do that, you'll get a sense of where you should compromise and where you shouldn't compromise. And most people who say, I just don't know if I should compromise about a thing or not, and I've had many years of pastoral experience, usually don't read the scriptures. It's pretty simple. Sometimes there are really hard questions. Even I can't really necessarily do anything more than pray with people and say, well, let God lead you in this one. But by and large, you get a good sense of that. And listen, I'm not trying to sugarcoat that problem. But compromise was a problem. This is the reason that they had trouble in the land. Now, if you go after this conversation, if after this video and read Judges 1, 2, and 3, you'll see that because of their compromise, God left the pagans in the land with the people as a thorn to constantly provoke them and remind them of those things. So again, sometimes the compromises that we have in our own lives, they tend to remain as thorns in our lives. Now, you shouldn't read yourself into scripture, but there's some interesting things going on here. The compromises that took place in Judges 1, 2, and 3 came more than likely as a result of individual decisions made by families. This family chose to not go to war with this tribe, and this one chose not to do that. So compromise wasn't on a national level only, but it was just on a highly localized level. Read it and let me know. And again, don't read yourself into scripture, but there's a good lesson here. The other one is apathy. Another thing you find is not everybody was necessarily only compromising, but some had apathy. I discovered this by looking at the Song of Deborah again. I read Judges, and then I said, I just haven't got this book. This is weeks ago. I'm going to read it again and read it again and read it more slowly. And so I'm really stuck here on Judges. But I saw a single verse in the book of Deborah, in the Song of Deborah, and it bounced off the page, and I thought, fascinating. And I had to consult the commentaries about that, but let me read it anyways for you. It is from Judges chapter 5, where Deborah recounts the miracle of deliverance the many miracles of deliverance that God had worked for his people in those times. But she makes an interesting comment in that time. Makes an interesting comment in recorded in Judges 5:23. Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord. Curse its inhabitants thoroughly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord against the Almighty. Then it goes on, talks about Jael, the woman who performed a heroic act. Curse Meroz. So this bounced off the page. I thought, who's Meroz? So the first thing I did was looked up to see if Meroz appears anywhere else in the Bible, and no. Just almost like a side note in history. What was the reason that Meroz was sinned? So again, I went to the commentaries, which is kind of obvious when you look at it on the surface, but the commentators say, more than likely, this is what happened. During a time when Meroz had to step up to help their brothers and to serve God, they decided, apathy, apathetic, just not going to do it. And for this, they're cursed, and they're a byword in history. We never hear from them again. They're not blessed like some of the other tribes. There's nothing well spoken about them. Apathy. Let's look at the three things here that are the headline for this little talk this morning. Rebellion, compromise, and apathy. Overall, from the book of Judges, in the book of Judges, from cover to cover, you see the people rebelling. They're delivered, then they rebel, they're delivered. What's the core of their rebellion? They do what's right in their own hearts. This is very, very costly, ladies and gentlemen, doing what's right in your own hearts. Rebellion. What is also there? Compromise. Well, rebellion often leads to compromise anyways. Often leads to compromise anyways. And by the way, you know what I'm talking about. Oh, stop that. And then, particularly, meros, apathy. These three things. Now, there are other things that you find in the book of Judges, things like idolatry and pride and arrogance and so on. The entire spectrum of human failings appears in the book of Judges, by the way. You don't think you can miss one. Nevertheless, these three jumped off the pages to me. Hey, do you want some homework? Read Judges 1, 2, and 3. And when I come back again in a few weeks' time and chat a little bit more about Judges, maybe it'll make a little bit of sense to you. Really interesting book. By the way, you could read the whole book. It's a tough read. But certainly the context of my comments here about rebellion, compromise, and apathy from the first 3 chapters of Judges, you get to see it. There you go. I'm going to be back again next week, Lord willing. We've got a really challenging week coming up, but by the grace of God, everything will flow nicely. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you again, not kind of rushing through and giving you highlights like normal, but spending a bit more time like I like to do. This has been Book of Judges, Compromise, Apathy, and Rebellion.